Today's Brown Bag features KU Associate Professor of Political Science, Mariya Omelicheva. Her research interests include Eurasian security, Russian foreign policy, counterterrorism, human rights, international human rights, and democracy promotion. And she's keeping busy right now, aside from a series of publications, but also work on a Minerva project, which examines the interrelationships of crime, terrorism, trafficking in Russia and Central Asia. So today she's examining Russia's own take on IR theory.
Thank you for the introduction, Bart. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and happy Valentine's Day. And I am going to apologize for coughing and puffing through this presentation, but I figured out that was not a good enough reason to cancel my talk, so just bear with me. I feel much better than I sound. And so what I'm going to be presenting today actually came out last year as an article that my PhD student, Lydia Zabitska, and I co-authored. And she's also one of the PhD students in this program working on a dissertation on Ukrainian politics. And it's a fairly new but very strong peer-reviewed journal out of East Europe. Currently, the headquarters are in the Czech Republic. And the editor was very sweet to allow free access to our article. So if you find my presentation a little bit incomprehensible, feel free to look it up. This can be accessed free of charge. And just a couple of words on the background of how this research came about. So there is this professional association, International Studies Association, that unites scholars whose interests relate to this very broad field of international relations. And they don't need to be political scientists, they can be political geographers, sociologists, foreign policy analysts, et cetera, et cetera. But it's one of the largest professional associations with thousands and thousands of members. And just like any other professional association, it holds annual conferences. And each annual conference will have a theme. So in 2015, the president for that year, for the conference, chose a theme titled Global IR and Regional Worlds, a new agenda for international studies. And it was quite timely. Why? Because there have been this, I wouldn't say growing concern, but awareness of the fact that we've been using Western lens, Western theories, Western concepts, Western vocabulary to talk about societies and politics that are not made, that are very different from what we experience in the West. So international relations as a field of study, just like many other social studies, has experienced this ubiquitous presence of ethnocentrism. So the questions arise whether or not we can understand and explain what's occurring in other parts of the world if we utilize something that's been based on the experiences of a state or a group of states. So in other words, we can't really understand something if we haven't had like a lived experience of being in that part of the world, in that culture. Hence we have area studies, we learn languages, and so on and so forth. And so we had a panel that focused specifically on national schools of international relations. So this question of national schools is pivotal to the discussion of the state of the discipline in Russia. Why? You may ask, well, you all heard about this very famous poem written by Russian poet Fyodor Tyutchev. You will not grasp her with your mind or cover with a common label, for Russia is one of a kind. Believe in her if you are able. So this notion that Russia is unique and can not be understood through the rational choice frameworks or through any kind of paradigms, preconceived notions or theories developed in the West, it's unique. It can only be understood through by looking at it through its own lens, or it could only be felt. It cannot be understood through the reason. So this idea resonates quite strongly with Russian academics and people and politicians. So in the Russian academia, very many scholars embrace a belief in the uniqueness of Russia as a country that operates according to a very different and unique rules of engagement, and therefore Russia's foreign policy, it's my field of research and my interest, it cannot be understood through the lens of Western IR theory, and I use IR as a shorthand for international relations. So several prominent Russian IR scholars have called for the creation of Russia's own social theory to explain the specificity of the Russian situation. So Russian scholars themselves call for the need to develop Russia's own international relations. And the Russian politicians too, they are claiming that, or trying to defend that Russia is unique but equal to other great powers in the world, and they've been trying to define and defend Russia's great power identity by rejecting and downgrading what they view as alien to Russia. So for Russian politicians, the reasoning goes as follows. We are not the West, and West is not us. West is alien, they cannot understand us, hence they cannot dictate us how to live. And so we cannot be expected to follow the political and economical trajectory or expectations, even theoretical expectations of the Western politicians and scholars. So these two narratives, academic and political, they go hand in hand, again inviting us to think about whether indeed there is this unique Russian way of thinking and studying international relations, what we call the School of International Relations in Russia. And then the second question, if indeed there is Russia's School of International Relations, is it better than Western international relations theories in helping us understand Russia's foreign policy conduct or Russia's view on international relations? So these are the two questions that we entertain in this study. So what is this that appears under the guise of Russia's international relations? And if there is such a school of Russian IR, can it really help us understand what's going on in Russia's foreign policy, as the Russian scholars claim? So how did we do it? Very, very briefly. So we did a systematic discourse analysis of the official rhetoric produced by the key foreign policy decision makers, the president, advisors, key ideologues, foreign policy minister. And to define the contours of Russia's IR, we resorted to the analysis of a number of textbooks with national significance. Those are the textbooks that Russia's Ministry of Education recommended to all programs in Russia's international relations as textbooks for study. And a good thing or a bad thing, it's a good and a bad. It's a blessing in disguise. So in the United States, it would have been a huge challenge to review all of the textbooks because there are so many. In Russia, the quantity of textbooks is not comparable to that of the United States. So there are very few IR texts. So it made it easier for us to examine. And the scholars of Russia's IR themselves argued that what textbooks present, it's formative, it's defining Russia's IR. So we thought that would be a very good piece of evidence for us to analyze. And we supplemented it with a variety of other publications coming from institutes and online journals listed over there on the slide. Okay, and I'm going to give you just a very brief background and then some examples of the key conclusions so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. So, compared to the field of international relations in the United States, Russian international relations is a very young discipline. In the Soviet Union, social sciences and IR were considered to be the bourgeois science, and so the Soviet scientists did not pursue IR studies until about 1960s. This is when some of the first publications in the field of IR began appearing. And there was a first course introduced in MGIMO, but even then there was very minimal engagement with the scholarship produced in the West. And another important difference that carried over into the post-Soviet Russia was that, contrary to the United States experiences where universities are the homes of teaching and research, those two tasks are separated in the Russian, in the Soviet and the Russian context. What it means is that universities up to this day are designated for teaching, okay? And research tasks are delegated to specific institutions the so-called scientific research institutions, or NIIs, from the Russian term Научно-исследовательский институт. And those NIIs are formed on the basis of some substantive interests, like the NII of philosophy, the NII of sociology, and there have been also a number of those based on kind of geographical or geographic dimensions. So the NII of the United States and Canada, the NII of Africa, of Latin America, and scientists working in those institutes had and continue to have minimal contacts with the university faculties, and were mostly engaged in the fundamental research or basic research. So in that context, international relations was not conceived as a separate field of study, but rather just a sum of disciplinary perspective on various aspects of interstate relations. And of course, I cannot overlook the fact that it was very, very ideological. So the scholars working in that realm had to make sure that it was consistent with the premises of Marxism, Leninism, and the precepts of the communist ideology. So IR was very ideologized. Fast forwarding to post-Soviet contacts. Obviously, the Russian scholars found themselves at a considerable disadvantage, not only because of the lack of resources to pursue research or to study IR, to learn from the Western counterparts, but also because of, they had very limited contacts with Western researchers, so they came in lacking in the methodological training, the knowledge of IR theory. And so another interesting development that occurred, especially in the 1990s, so you have this vacuum of support from the government, kind of intellectual vacuum, disillusionment with everything that they learned previously. So a lot of, especially the older generation of Russian IR scholars, they had a very difficult time adjusting to the new realities and expectations, and there was considerable exodus of Russian IR scientists from the universities and academia, and they looked for employment elsewhere. The younger generation of scholars, those who began their training during Gorbachev's period, they were in a little bit better situation, a little bit easier to adapt to those changing conditions, and they were also able to take advantage of a variety of programs offered by Western foundations, but also funded through the U.S. Department of State. So those programs offered resources for professionalization and training and support for research for the Russian scientists. Of course, lots of those programs pursued liberal agendas. So, and interestingly, you can find lots of scholars trained in different facets of liberal theory. And so this younger generation of IR, schooled in Western IR theory, what did they do? They translated a lot of knowledge they gained from this program into a series of textbooks and monographs designed to spread and popularize Western concepts. It was more prestigious. It was easy to get grant money for this kind of work. And also greater professionalization opportunities to engage in collaborative research projects with Western counterparts, come to the United States or other Western states to present at the conferences. Okay, so despite all of these disadvantages, now looking back, taking stock of the past 25 or so years of the developments in IR in Russia, we concluded that, IR is an established field of study in the context of the Russian Federation. As evidenced in about 80 or so universities offering programs in international relations. There are master's programs, there are doctorate programs, textbooks that are coming out of the elite universities in Moscow, St. Petersburg, but also out of the regional centers. I'm just going to go to ISA meeting next week, and we have a very large section on post-Soviet states or systems, and we have lots of scholars coming from Russia to take part in this conference, but also many other conferences. So Russian scholars do engage in collaborative projects. They do publish in Western journals, so they've been so a lot of scholars found a way to become part of the Western enterprise of international relations. But even in Russia itself, lots of publications, lots of journals, and so on and so forth. there is associations like the Russian International Studies Association is a Russia-specific, the Russian branch of International Studies Association. So, yeah, so many positive developments. Then the question, however, remains, is there then a distinct Russian international relations, as I ask, or we asked in this research study? So our position is this, and I will demonstrate it later on with a few examples. Although the discipline of Russian international relations has matured since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it retains a highly ideological and relativist character that limits its global appeal. What I mean by relativist character is that it lacks criteria for self-reflection and criticism the way Western IR has. The dominant Russian international relations perspectives have resonated with the worldview and foreign policy agenda of the Kremlin administration, not because they've offered a novel and productive way of studying Russian foreign policy, but because Russia's theoretical perspectives have been shaped by and large by political rather than academic considerations. So in other words, Russia's IR and Russia's foreign policy, they've been almost like co-evolving. In international relations, we use the notion of co-constitution. So they've been kind of circular. So for example, both academics and politicians have been concerned about Russia's place in the world, that we need to find a more just and stable world order. They've been concerned with Western preeminence and an effort to find ways to resist American hegemony. Okay, so from both political and academic standpoint, we need new ways of thinking about international relations to counter Western hegemony. So Russian foreign policy makers, Putin, Lavrov, and others, they have put forth new assertions on the principles, practices, and institutions. Multipolarity, polycentrality. I'll give you a few more of those examples. So the policymakers came up with new ideas to justify why this world is unjust, why American hegemony is harmful and destabilizing. Okay, so Russian IR scholars have endowed this new construct with epistemological significance and began claiming them as specifically Russian approaches to IR informed by the local situations. But then these same constructs, academic constructs, have been used by Russian foreign policy makers to provide scientific basis for foreign policies they utilize. So in other words, the beliefs and imageries about the world developed in the academic context that were borrowed from the political discourse, they later become the accepted assumptions of foreign policy. So it becomes kind of like circular, so co-evolving. Okay, and so in the article, we show a spectrum of theoretical perspectives developed in IR in Russia, ranging from the most conservative, political realism and geopolitics, to more liberal and others. So obviously I'm not going to go over all of that. I'm going to give you just some examples from political realism, a school of thought that's been, even Western analysts argue that Russia has been using kind of political realist lens as to guide its foreign policy actions. So again, just for the purpose of illustration and in a very simplified way, I'm going to show you how political discourse has informed academic writings and back. So Vladimir Putin has been very famous for portraying the world as a constant, perpetual struggle for geopolitical interest, where he doesn't exactly use Thucydides' word that the one who has power is going to do whatever consistent with the national interests. But essentially, this what he's been saying in his speeches, that when Russia was weak, the West took advantage of it. Now Russia has capabilities. So capabilities decide whether or not a state can act upon its national interest defined in terms of power. So national capabilities determine whether a state has any clout in international politics or is considered weak. And of course, his speeches are replete with references to the danger, not only to Russia, but his rhetoric portrays the United States as danger to the international stability. So there is this uneasiness and discontent with the growing power of the United States, which is held responsible for destabilizing international affairs. Okay, so in the academia, the majority of Russian scholars are, if not all, working in the realist genre, they concur in their assessment of unipolar structure as the most damaging to international stability. Okay, not only they approach it from the analytical standpoint, but they reify. So they say it is harmful from the analytical standpoint, but because it's harmful, it's no longer existent. So similarly to the Russian foreign policy officials who declared an end to the unipolar world, Russian academics also contend that multipolarity or its variants constitute an established reality. However, they fall short providing theoretical justifications, just like Western academics do. So we have a very lively debate within the School of Political Realism about which international structure, unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar, is less or more conducive to international peace and security. So there is much less of this kind of theoretical discussion that is going on in Russia's academia, but there is much more kind of that polemical discussion about the repercussions or the consequences of the American international conduct, so the criticisms of American international conduct. So the Russian politicians introduced the idea of multipolarity, which they treat as, so they don't like to think about the world as unipolar. They think about the world as multipolar, where the United States is trying to encroach upon this multipolarity. Okay, so since 2008, so academics portray it as a fait accompli. The politicians treat it as such as well. Since recently, they also introduced the notion of polycentric world order as an alternative to American hegemony. Politicians are not very explicit or articulate exactly about what polycentric world order entails, but if you look at the rhetoric, multipolar world has been almost everywhere replaced with polycentric world order. Kind of an idea is that not only states are the key actors in world politics, there are groups of states, there are also international organizations with some political clout, but recognizing the role of non-state actors as well. So in the academia, there have been various ways in which scholars have tried to justify this new concept of polycentric world order embraced by the Russian government. I'll give you one example. So the scholar whose name is it escapes my mind. So he essentially compared the notion of polarity to electric circuit, where you have kind of a negative and a positive that eliminate each other, as a way of suggesting that unipolar world cannot exist. Unipolar world is the one that has no pole. Essentially kind of an academic theoretical discussion of dismissing unipolarity as not even making sense on the backdrop of the way polarity is used in natural sciences, in engineering. And so they've come up with different ways to think about polycentric world and what it is made up of. So there is this lively discussion about what kind of centers are there that constitute this polycentric world, and Russia is inevitably there. And so there is no consensus about exactly what the centers are, but there is also consensus that there is a shift in power from the West to the East, the Asian axis. So the growing course of Russian realist scholars began asserting that the geopolitical center of power in international relations is moving towards East and Asia. And so the Russian government is not really consistent with everything that American realists claim about international politics. Why? Because the Russian government has been has been also talking about the importance of ideas and culture, and introduced this notion of Russia's civilization, which is not defined by territory or material capabilities, but more about affinity among the people that are united by history and cultural values and whatnot. And so this discussion of civilizational aspects of world politics has also transpired in the context of the discussions about what makes a great power or what makes a center of power. So the Russian government has been emphasizing the importance of soft power, where Russia's model of development and some sort of normative appeal is spread and disseminated among other countries. And Russian realists of all stripes do share, the Russian government believes that Russia is and will always be a great power because of not only material capabilities, but because of the emphasis has been shifting on this kind of cultural uniqueness or cultural historical heritage and so on and so forth. So, but interestingly, the Russian realists have transmuted the theoretical discussion of global hegemony into a philosophical, sociological, and psychological exploration of the topic of global leadership. So this is where some of kind of the Soviet background comes into play here, where they have a political agenda to corroborate the argument the United States is not a hegemon, or it's a bad hegemon. So now they are engaging in a variety of kind of philosophical, sociological discussion revolving around what good leadership entails to demonstrate that Russia is a good leader, the United States is not. So, in a nutshell, we find a lot of correspondence between what the Russian academics say about Russia's view on international politics, international relations, and Russia's foreign policy, and the way governments act in foreign policy or official foreign policy discourse. So it seems like Russian IR perspectives are able to account for Russian foreign policy and views, but it's not, we argue, it's not because of their analytical utility. It's not because Russia has some sort of a unique established school of international relations, but it is because the academic and foreign policy discourses have been co-evolving. The emphasis on Russia's great power identity, concerns with the U.S. domination of global affairs, and the search for models of a just and progressive world order have been pivotal for both academic and political discourses in Russia. And, okay, so this is not unique to Russia, okay? We find this kind of impact of ideology on academics in many different contexts, including in the United States, okay? There are, however, important differences. In the context of the United States, when theories get translated into foreign policy, they become just thin veneers, thin justification. So they lose the sophistication, and they're not anymore perceived of as kind of theoretical basis for foreign policy. Number one. Number two, because of the impact of positivism with its emphasis on scientific method, there have been kind of lots of checks and balances on those ideological conclusions as drivers of foreign policy. And I can elaborate on it in the Q&A. This has been missing in the context of Russia's academia. It has been lacking that kind of self-reflexivity. So we define IR as a field of study defined by a set of concepts and theories, accompanied methodological basis, but also criteria, clearly defined criteria to for validity and reliability of those theories and empirical findings. This is you don't find it in the context of Russia's IR. This is not to say that there are no strong Russia's IR scholars. There are plenty, but they are working in the Western paradigms of international relations. There have been some conceptual innovations, but they've been short of the kinds of theories that guide IR research in the Western academia. And there are also this impact of historical and institutional circumstances that amplify the impact of the Russian politics on Russian social studies and their subsequent ideologization. So it's not news to you that quite few policymakers in Russia who are involved in foreign policy decision makers, they're also academics. So they go back and forth. Academics became politicians. Politicians, it's prestigious. They go and they buy or they get the degree. So you have politicians turn academics or vice versa, and so you have this kind of scientific knowledge without actually a very strong academic background. And then you're also familiar with some of the recent reforms implemented by Vladimir Putin, including the law that essentially banned any kind of Western support, including to Russia's academia, that made it very difficult for Russia's academics to pursue non-ideologized work. And then there have been also some reforms that essentially they took away the Russian Academy of Science rights to control its own institutions and land, and now there's a bunch of bureaucrats that are in charge. So it really, there are some things that have been limiting academic freedoms there. So it all contributes to this politicization of science. Again, that is not to say that there is no good science. There is more. And one last thing. So if you look at the brain drain data, there have been an exodus of scholars leaving Russia in the 90s and in 2000. Based on those based on what's the available statistics show that of all those left, social scientists constitute only 3%. 3%. So the majority of those who left were natural scientists and engineers. What it means is that, and we can talk about why, but what it means is that Russian social scientists, including IR scholars, they left, and you are either a hero or a villain, or you're kind of a scholar who wants to keep the job and get some funds from the government. And so the majority of those who stay and teach and do research, they fall in that middle. And so, and they perpetuate these narratives about the uniqueness of Russia's situation and Russia's needing its own social theory, and that what social scientists produce is unique to Russia and it's better at accounting for what Russia has done and is doing, etc. So this all fits into this last paragraph that I put there, that there are these historical and institutional circumstances that amplify the impact of Russian politics on Russia's social studies. Okay, we've got plenty of time to talk about